Founded in 1884, the Christian Century magazine has been a major voice in mainline Protestantism for over 100 years. With a new century well underway, this distinguished journal of comment and opinion continues to tackle tough issues at the intersection of life and faith. We welcome Dr. John Buchanan, the Christian Century's editor and publisher. I'm glad to have you here today, Dr. Buchanan.
Nice to be here.
Tell us a little bit about the founding of the Christian Century.
Well, it's an interesting story, Polly. The Christian Century actually had a life before it was called the Christian Century. It was founded, I think, in 1884 as a Disciples of Christ journal called the Christian Oracle. And along about 1908, the magazine got in a little trouble financially, and it was purchased outright. It was actually in bankruptcy. It was purchased outright by Charles Clayton Morrison, who always wanted to be the editor and publisher of a magazine, and it was rechristened the Christian Century, and it has been in existence ever since.
And what do you think his hope was at that time in naming it the Christian Century?
Well, he was part of a very optimistic time when church people and Christian leaders thought they were living really at the beginning of the Christian century, that by the end of the 20th century, the world would pretty much all be Christian and all the problems of the world would have disappeared and there would be peace and prosperity.
That would have been nice.
That would have been nice.
113 years later, what do you think those founders would think of the magazine now?
Well, we'd like to think that they would be proud of it, that we have continued the traditions of commenting on the issues of the day and holding up alternative ideas for people in the religious marketplace. I think they would be pleased. Obviously, they would be surprised at the form and style that all journalism has taken. The magazine doesn't look anything like it did 100 years ago, but I think they would be happy with the direction that we've taken.
They probably didn't expect that you could get it on the internet.
That's for sure. That's for sure.
Now, you've been the editor for about 14 years.
Mm-hmm.
What changes have you seen in that period?
Well, a couple of changes. Of course, it's the digital age, and people are simply not reading newspapers or magazines as they used to. And so everybody has had to be flexible and change and think about how to access the marketplace of ideas in a day when people are simply not reading print as much. We continue to have a loyal readership. But we also are spending some energy and some resources trying to figure out how to be accessible to people my children's generation who do most of their information gathering online.
And you came to your job as editor from parish ministry.
Mm-hmm.
The tagline for the magazine now is thinking critically, living faithfully. What does that mean for you as someone who's been a pastor?
Well, sometimes popular religion seems to be almost anti-intellectual and anti-ideas. And so it's the mission of this magazine, and one that's dear to my heart, to present Christian theology and religious thinking in intellectually challenging and responsible ways. We think there's a great opportunity for religion and the culture to be in dialogue, and that means being knowledgeable about and commenting on politics and environmental issues and educational issues and political issues and art issues.
What would you say, you've listed a few of them, but what are some of the main topics that are current and being addressed in the journal?
Well, not surprisingly, globalization, the fact that we live on a smaller planet, that people from different faith communities and nationalities and races are oftentimes now living on the same block as we. So it's no longer an abstraction. We need to learn how to live responsibly and authentically and lovingly with people of different faiths and different ethnic backgrounds. Immigration is an issue that has heavy theological and religious implications. The Judeo-Christian tradition puts a lot of weight on the virtue of hospitality and welcoming the stranger, and so we try to comment on that. The ecology, we know that ecologically we're not in a very good position right now, and we think there's a strong religious word to be said on behalf of caring for God's great creation. the politics of the day, the division of the House politic into two warring factions where people are no longer even talking to each other. We think there's a spiritual dimension to being open to one another, being hospitable, being able to be in dialogue. So a lot of that is the sort of things we're talking about.
Now, there are those people who would say they don't want their politics and their religion mixing. What might you say to someone who resisted the idea of the faithful thinking about political and cultural issues?
Well, it really depends on your theological position. If you believe that religion is to interface with all of life, then of course religion and politics have a great deal to do with one another. Now, I don't mean partisan politics, but there are religious dimensions to every single political issue. The other alternate position is to withdraw from the world and to practice your religion almost in isolation from what's going on. I don't think, the Christian Century doesn't think that's what Jesus did. Jesus lived pretty thoroughly in the world and calls Christian people to live thoroughly in the world, bringing their faith to engage with all the thorny, tough issues.
Now, someone who did that engaging was Martin Luther King. I understand there was a connection between Martin Luther King Jr. and the Century.
Yes, a fascinating connection. When he was quite young, before he became a household name, he was a very legitimate rising theologian and thinker. He was always involved in the racial justice issue, but with a solid theological background. He had his PhD in theology from Boston University, and the magazine asked him to serve as one of our editors at large. We have always had a collection of kind of leading spokespersons from throughout the country, and King was one of those in the late 40s, late 50s. When we followed him, we published some of his essays, and when he was arrested in Birmingham and wrote a letter from Birmingham jail, which everybody knows about, he sent it to us, to the Christian Century. And the Christian Century was the first publication to actually publish that document. And one of our office treasures, of course, is the original letter from Birmingham jail well, not his handwritten, but he had a typewriter, access to a typewriter. Oh,
that is a treasure. Who are some of your current contributors? What type of people are doing writing for the journal now?
Well, I mentioned William Willimon, who now is a seminary professor, but was a Methodist bishop, and before that, for a long time, the very popular and very bright chaplain at Duke University. He's a regular writer for us. Some others would include Walter Brueggemann, who's a great Old Testament scholar, Kathleen Norris, a novelist, Barbara Brown Taylor, who is a best-selling writer. These are people that we try to keep in print as often and frequently as we can.
And what would you say about your professional journey from leaving the pulpit to a different kind of pulpit, perhaps?
Well, it feels to me like a natural extension of what I was doing all my life, except you do it on paper instead of in a pulpit. I think it's been a nice transition, and I've enjoyed it thoroughly, and it just feels right to me.
There's been a lot of recent discussion about a program on the History Channel on the stories of the Bible, and I understand you wrote an editorial response to that for the Christian Century. Could you tell us a little about that?
Well, first I want to thank the History Channel. In a time of general biblical ignorance, anytime the biblical story can gain some public attention, I think it's a wonderful thing. I'm all for it. One of my concerns about that portrayal is that there's a lot of violence in the biblical story, and there's no denying it, no erasing it. It lends itself to television, to media portrayal, and sometimes it feels to me as if it almost overwhelms the rest of the story. So there's a lot of blood, there's a lot of death, there's a lot of destruction in that portrayal, and I think it probably, my commentary on that would be, it plays a more major role in the television presentation than it does in the Bible itself.
Okay. And in our recent lives, there is a lot of violence and there is a lot of vulgar things happening, and people are often trying to find the role of God in all of that. Could you respond to where you think God might be in the events such as the Boston bombings?
Well, I personally do not believe that God is involved in violence at all. Our position is that God is a God of love, and that peace on earth is the great, great dream of all people of faith. The Abrahamic community of Muslims and Christians and Jews all look for that day of peace. I think there are religiously radical organizations in every religion, and it could be that they stir up people who are already inclined to be violent. But the religions themselves, certainly Islam, Christianity, Judaism, are basically not violent religions, but in fact peace-loving religions.
What do you imagine for the next 100 years for the Christian century?
Well, no one quite knows what print publications are going to look like even 10 years from now. Every newspaper, every magazine is scurrying, trying to keep the attention of subscribers and readers, while at the same time trying to discover what the new digital format might be that we're all going to have to adapt. I have no idea what that's going to look like, but I can be pretty sure that it's not going to look like it does today. We've always seen ourselves as a spokesperson for mainline Protestant Christianity. And as everyone knows, mainline Protestant Christianity is undergoing terrific change right now. So I think the Christian century will continue to broaden and address itself to and attempt to speak for the entire Christian community, evangelical, more progressive, and also the interfaith community. That, of course, is one of the biggest issues facing all of us.
Well, thank you so much for being here today, Dr. Buchanan. I'm Polly Toner for Different Drummers and the Greater Chicago Broadcast Ministries. Keep the faith.